Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Scrum, Politico's weekly podcast. I'm Reid Epstein in the Politico newsroom here in snow-stricken Washington. We're talking about the big topics this week. House Speaker John Boehner bails on a debt limit fight with the White House and Democrats. The White House hosts the president of France for a state dinner. And Rand Paul files a class action lawsuit against the Obama administration over the NSA tactics. For all of that, we have a great team of politicos. We have Deputy White House Editor Rebecca Sinderbrand, Deputy Congress Editor Stephen Sloan, and Byron Tau, our hard-working author of the daily Politico influence lobbying tip sheet. Before we get into these topics, let's first start with your headlines of the week. Rebecca, why don't you go first?
I'm going to talk about the only story that matters right now, which is, the return of Snowpocalypse, son of Snowpocalypse, once again bearing down on Washington, D.C., hitting the city this week and actually making a difference on Capitol Hill. So
forcing some votes in both the House and the Senate up.
That's
so
right.
The members
all it takes are forces of nature.
Because heaven forbid members of Congress stay in town during a snowstorm.
Definitely not.
Like the rest of us.
Like the rest of us.
Yes, I think the debt ceiling is my headline of the week. Influenced by all this snow, forcing votes to be held more promptly than they would have been otherwise, and everybody kind of went into this debate thinking that it was going to be pretty easy, and it turns out it wasn't so easy. So, pretty interesting week.
Byron?
Obviously, the story of the week is the French president going stag or solo to the state dinner on Tuesday night here in Washington, D.C. The sort of awkwardness around that, I think, was emblematic of the awkwardness that America is facing on the world stage with, NSA charges and all manner of diplomatic catastrophe.
Quelle horreur, Byron.
Quelle horreur, indeed, Reid.
We'll transition from that. Let's talk first about the debt limit fight. Stephen, we'd heard from House Republicans that this time was going to be different. Since the big debt limit showdown of 2011, we've had a couple instances where they've gone to the brink and then ultimately caved, putting forward clean debt limit increases. This time, they had a number of different plans. None of them seemed to work, and Tuesday morning, House Speaker Boehner threw in the towel and passed a bill with almost entirely Democratic votes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really quite something to see. Every iteration that we go through this, at this point, it seems like the Republican hand gets weaker and weaker, and that was clearly on display this week. Monday evening at 5:45, the Speaker is meeting with his party saying we're going to move forward with this bill that raises the debt ceiling and also addresses military pension cuts, restores military pension cuts. Fast forward to 10 o'clock the next morning, and it's actually, we're not going to do that. We're just going to completely do what the Democrats want, a clean debt limit increase, and we'll basically rely entirely on Democratic votes to make that happen. And much the same happened in the Senate on Wednesday when it really was unclear how this was going to go. It seemed at one point that the Senate might actually block.
Ted Cruz talked about filibustering.
And there was a filibuster. There was a filibuster that had to be overcome, and none other than Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn, the two top Republicans in the Senate, who are both in you could define tough in different ways for their races, but they're in competitive primary races, and they both had to vote to allow the debt limit bill to go forward. Ted Cruz put them in that position. It's a position that they can't be thrilled to have been in. But ultimately, it was just another example of Republican leaders just doing whatever it took to get this issue off their plate.
Is this the end of this as a hot-button issue?
Well, it's the end of it for now. We won't be dealing with the debt ceiling again until March 15th, 2015. Mark your calendars. But and at that time, if it's an entirely Republican Congress, it will be very interesting to see how a Republican-controlled House and Senate works with the president in his last 2 years on this issue.
I also think it's funny that the markets have just sort of learned to ignore what happens around the debt ceiling. We didn't see Wall Street paying the kind of attention that they had previously paid to previous incarnations of this fight. It was kind of just a yawn and an expectation that it would ultimately happen, and that Republican leadership was committed to making it happen somehow, some way.
And the White House seemed pretty serene about this whole drama, too.
That's right. It's all old hat at this point.
They didn't move off of their contention that the president wouldn't negotiate. They didn't freak out when it looked when Speaker Boehner and other Republicans floated attaching all manner of things to a debt limit crisis. They just sort of let it go and assumed that they would win out in the end.
Right, and you saw this rapidly de-escalating series of demands, even when it got to the point, and of course, the White House very firmly had never want to talk about hypotheticals, but when someone was asking Jay Carney very specifically, okay, if it comes down to, just military pay, the symbolic move on restoring those military pensions, and it's totally offset in the budget, and so it's not even really a demand at all. Would that be okay with you guys? And they said, absolutely not. Nothing attached to it. It's got to be clean all the way. And so, they've gotten to the point where, they know their role to play in this as well. They've been taught at this point not to cave at all.
Perhaps for the editors in our roundtable today, on the podcast today, one key question is it the end of the brinkmanship or the end of the brinksmanship?
It's brinkmanship, and don't forget it.
Because it's been both ways, both in our copy and elsewhere in the media.
And from the White House podium, it's been brinksmanship consistently, which, we'll quote it as they say it, but they're saying it wrong.
That's the same on the Congress team?
I know better than to disagree with the White House team on this particular source of contention.
Let's move on to our second big story this week. The state dinner for French President Francois Hollande. Some of you have better French accents than I do. Byron, of course, went to college in Montreal, so he's probably the expert on this podcast today. But the President Obama and Hollande seemed to get along pretty well at their joint press conference Tuesday at the White House. President Obama talked about the U.S. and France having a close alliance. President Hollande talked about him personally and Obama having a close alliance, something he's using to boost his political prospects back at home. But the state dinner was interesting because it was missing Hollande's date because, of course, he, in the last couple of months, has gone through a very public breakup from his longtime girlfriend.
That's right. And it's a pretty stark moment. It's been a couple of decades since the last time you actually had a stag head of state at a state dinner. We actually went back and checked the history books. It looks like Indira Gandhi, way back in the 1970s, was the last sitting head of state to come to the White House without a date. So this is kind of a bit of a challenge for the planners, kind of figuring it out. Of course, one of the things that was most notable is they didn't have exactly the same sort of dancing, although, as we pointed out, there was some dancing, but not the kind of
Mary J.
official.
Blige is singing, there has to be some dancing.
Dance. But not the kind of official, nothing that would, shine the spotlight on, this is a man who's here without some sort of companion.
Right, and they had Monsieur Hollande sit between the Obamas and not off to the side. They had him at a table, oddly, with Stephen Colbert, who the New York Times definitely noted his connection to France is that he pronounces his name in a French way. But they seem to really make this look like there was nothing to see here as far as Hollande's personal domestic situation goes.
Well, I mean, the question I have is how hard is it for the head of state to get a date? I suppose there are some complicated domestic political considerations, but it seems to me that a ticket to the White House for a fancy dinner is...
You'd think he could, walk through the sort of modeling district of Paris and find someone to go with him.
Certainly. I feel like it's not... sometimes reporters have tickets to give away to White House functions, and it doesn't seem to be too hard to get someone to go with you. So I'm surprised the French president had any difficulty.
Pro tip from Byron.
You can email Byron btau@politico.com for all of your dating questions here in Washington. We'll move on to our third element here. Rand Paul, Wednesday morning, filed a class action lawsuit against the Obama administration over the NSA tactics. He had former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli making his first real public appearance in a while. Was there with him outside federal court in Washington, as was the head of the Tea Party group Freedom Works. Paul's lawsuit, of course, came complete with a press conference, and it's, as our Katie Glick wrote on Politico.com, is being used as a tool to generate names and enthusiasm for a future campaign for Senator Paul.
That's right. It's a data gold mine. It's you join onto his cause, and all of a sudden he's got this long list. It's worth its weight in gold of names, email addresses, contact information for loads of potential 2016 supporters and donors.
And the White House has responded with its usual tact that 15 federal judges have declared that the NSA wiretapping, the NSA surveillance programs are illegal. What Rand Paul is doing is essentially a publicity stunt. But do we think that there is going to be some momentum to this in Congress? Is there any similarities to his drone filibuster from a year ago? Is this something that he's going to get much support from his Republican colleagues?
He might get some, but I think that this is Rand Paul is just identified with the NSA. That's his thing now, and I think that this is just more evidence of that. And it's interesting to me, he's not really being dissuaded at all by recent reports that it was 20% of data that was collected, a much more narrow slice of data than was initially suspected, even though 20% of that much data is still a lot of data that's being collected. But this is his campaign, and and he will use his perch from the Senate to pursue it.
I also think what's interesting about the surveillance debate right now is just how we talk a lot about partisanship. We talk a lot about how Congress is divided along party lines, but it's fascinating how this issue does not break down along party lines. You have very conservative Republicans, or very hawkish Republicans, I should say, like Lindsey Graham, like Senator John McCain, like Mike Rogers, who's chair of the Intel Committee, who have all come down pretty on the side of the president and said that these are very important surveillance programs. And then you have Senator Rand Paul and Senator Wyden from out west who oppose this. So it's just an interesting political divide that we have on this particular topic.
It's a good place to stop. We'll take a quick break for some programming notes. We'll be right back with more from our team, the highlights round, and This Week in Hillary.
Hey, podcast listeners. Next Friday, we have the big Politico 4th Annual State Solutions Conference as the National Governors Association comes to town. We'll have governors from across the country focusing on innovative approaches that their states have taken to address complex problems. That's Friday, February 21st at 8 a.m. For more information, you can check out politico.com/events. It will also stream live at politico.com/live. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to the Scrum. I'm here with Politico's Byron Tau, Stephen Sloan, and Rebecca Sinderbrand. It's time for our highlights round. We'll touch on some big moments from this week, and we'll get some takes from you guys. First, Chris Christie's back on the road. He went to Chicago this week and raised $1 million for the Republican Governors Association. It seems like Christie is sort of shrugging off a lot of the flack that's come his way over the Bridgegate scandal, or Bridgegazi, whichever we're calling it, and is out doing what the head of a Republican Governors Association does, which is raise a lot of money for people running for governor.
Absolutely, and the interesting thing to hear what he had to say is he very much, of course, sounded like someone who's running for president and talking about how the party tends to be pragmatic when it comes to picking a president, which of course would seem to point towards him instead of perhaps some of the more colorful additions to the 2016 field. So he's been out there, he's been visible. He hasn't been taking as many questions from the press as New Jersey reporters perhaps would like. That's kind of understandable at this point, but he's not disappearing by any stretch. He
said some of his people have made mistakes, but didn't take responsibility for him making any mistakes personally.
Not yet.
Move to our second point in the highlights round. There was a story on Politico by our colleagues Anna Palmer and Manu Raju about the Koch brothers really dropping almost an endless amount of money against Kay Hagan, North Carolina senator. They're also in big against Mary Landrieu in Louisiana. Really a push to turn the Senate Republican after the 2014 midterms to go along with the Republican House.
Yeah, I think that it really just reflects the confidence that Republicans have right now that what might have seemed like a pipe dream, especially around the time, end of October, beginning of November, right after the government shutdown, when Republicans just seemed to have nothing going for them. There's a real chance that they could recapture the Senate. They'll definitely maintain the House, maybe even expand their control there, and really exercise dominance in Washington for the last 2 years of the president's term. And there, a lot of money was thrown into the 2012 race, but many Republicans feeling like they're wasn't a lot of bang for that. But I think as you see what's happening, in these races that you mentioned, it just reflects this growing sense that Republicans really have a shot at winning this.
And you can tell that they're feeling optimistic. The debt ceiling was extended until March of 2015. Seems like immigration is essentially dead, at least for the rest of this year. That their Republicans feel like they're going to wait until they have more controls over more of the levers of power before trying to push their agenda.
They'll have controls over the levers of power, and I think that even if you look at the debt ceiling vote in the Senate on Wednesday, there was a time that Senators McConnell and Cornyn would have been more than happy to let the Senate block that legislation. But if that legislation was blocked and we were really beginning to flirt with the possibility of default, we would be back in last fall for Republicans. The political momentum would really be that they've experienced these past few months would really be in danger, and I think that they're really working to avoid that because they think that they can continue to ride this wave.
And certainly a lot of Republicans feel like if that's really the only thing holding them back from maintaining majorities would be a debt default, because that would inevitably be blamed on them.
I think that's just right.
Move on to our last point in our highlights round, our weekly segment about where is Hillary Clinton now. This week we had a big story drop in the Washington Free Beacon about some papers that one of Hillary's friends had donated to the University of Arkansas that had apparently been available for a number of years and just came out in a report in the Beacon earlier this week.
Was it a big story? I only read the mainstream media, and I kind of got a bit of a sense that nothing really happened. No, but in all seriousness, this was a pretty deep dive into an academic archive that's been available for any reporter who was enterprising enough to peruse it since 2010. And, the Washington Free Beacon sent someone to do a fair amount of archival research and dug up, I would say, nothing groundbreaking, but certainly some interesting little nuggets. We have Hillary Clinton calling Monica Lewinsky a narcissistic loon, and some other colorful details from the Clinton administration in the 90s. And I think this is a big problem just going forward for Hillary, that a lot of the archival material that from the Clinton administration is actually set to be released or declassified or open to the public shortly, if not already. And this is, I expect there's a number of other archives that will open to researchers very shortly. And this might generate some headlines.
It's interesting because, Hillary has done such a good job over the years to really distance herself from that entire episode. The affair, the impeachment, it's really not associated with her anymore. So it's
despite the best efforts of our friend Rand Paul.
Exactly, but she has, never really talks about it, and so to see any little snippet of her reaction to this, especially at the time, is even though it's a narcissistic little tune or whatever, it's only a few words, it still somehow carries some power.
And it another element of this story was that the Free Beacon sort of gleefully pointed out was the reticence of big news organizations that's linked back to the story or talked about the story from saying their name. They put together a supercut of TV anchors referring to the Free Beacon in various ways without saying the words Washington Free Beacon.
And I really do think they have a point there. I mean, Mother Jones, a liberal magazine, broke a big story during the campaign where Mitt Romney called 47% of Americans takers, and the cable networks didn't call them an anti-Romney website. I mean, they legitimately gave them credit for what was a pretty big scoop, and I think the Free Beacon has a point here that they, as a conservative organization, a conservative media outlet, are kind of getting the short end of the stick here when it comes to being cited and being credited for doing some pretty good reporting and digging into archives.
Let's finish up with our shout-outs round. We'll go quickly around the table. Our virtual table, as it were. Key reads, videos, follows, restaurants, something you ate or saw or heard this week that our listeners should take a look at.
I'm going to reach back, and I'm going to give a shout out, and this is in no way political, but just for pure artistic pleasure, to the Russian Police Choir for their rendition of Daft Punk's Get Lucky at the opening ceremonies. I appreciated it. I enjoyed it. The fabulousness of it was felt even on this side of the Atlantic. So I'd just like to give kudos to their latest performance.
It's pretty amazing that everyone seems to have seen that, even though NBC
did not
somehow elected not to put it on the air.
Amazing edit. I cannot understand that editorial choice. Definitely someone dropped the ball in there.
Rebecca Sinderbrand.
Former television producer.
Producer of the next Olympic Games.
Right. I'm just throwing that out there.
Steve.
I'm going to go forward a little bit and just say I'm excited for the release of House of Cards. I know what I'm doing this weekend. Watched the last season and enjoyed it. And the New York Times had a great profile of Robin Wright, and I love her.
I think I'd like to shout out the entire region of New England, being a place that knows how to deal with snow and can just takes weather as it comes. You know, it is what it is. It snows when it snows. It rains when it rains, and there's no freaking out.
As an Atlanta native, I'd like you to see me rolling my eyes right now.
Yeah, well,
he's like simultaneously shouting out and throwing shade, as one does with the shout outs.
Along that line, I will shout out our competitors at the Washington Post's Capitol Weather Gang, who really have an indispensable minute-by-minute update about what is going to happen, what is going to fall from the sky here in the D.C. area later this week. The Capitol Weather Gang covers the weather like Politico covers politics, and it's really a must-read. At one point on Tuesday, of the 5 most read stories on the Post website, 4 were from the Capitol Weather Gang, and 1 was about Bob Costas' eyes. So
I think you have the pull quote for their next ad campaign right there.
Like, if you don't get it, you don't get it.
Right.
This actually proves my point, because if you go to the Globe website, this would never happen. Boston Globe. This just wouldn't.
If you could get on the Boston Globe website.
Ouch.
Byron, Steve, and Rebecca, thanks for being on the show. If you want to hear more of these stories, head to Politico.com. You can find us at Politico.com/podcast. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. Just search for Politico Podcast. I'm Reid Epstein. That's the Scrum. Thank you for listening.